Hello and welcome. This audio recording is designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam and will go over a question which may be found on a Part C of a Paper 1 answer. You may find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your revision. Today we will be looking at the following question. Why did the First Gulf War take place? Many of you will be very familiar with what us history teachers call the PEE technique. That is to say, make a point, back it up with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, and then explain using phrases such as "this shows" or "this suggests." So in this response we will give a 5-part scope, which means you would be expected to write 5 PEEs. So let's get started. Point 1. The historical claim. Evidence to support this includes: until the end of World War I, Kuwait had officially been part of the Turkish Empire's province of Basra, but the ruling Al Sabah family had enjoyed a large measure of independence. The British had accepted responsibility for Kuwait's defence and foreign affairs in 1899 and in 1922 had helped establish Kuwait's boundaries with Iraq and Saudi Arabia. The association between Kuwait and Basra led a number of Iraqi rulers to insist that Kuwait was rightfully part of Iraq. Both King Ghazi in the late 1970s and President Qasem in 1961 had also demanded the incorporation of Kuwait into Iraq. So, in explaining our first point, you could argue that there was an historical claim that Iraq had a right to rule Kuwait. Point 2. Saddam Hussein's domestic position. Despite Saddam's attempt to represent the Iran-Iraq war as an Iraqi victory, he realised that the Iraqi people would soon see through the propaganda. In reality, their country had endured a costly and bloody conflict that had essentially ended where it started. Iraq displayed many of the characteristics of a defeated power, as inflation was followed by price controls. Iraqi prisoners remained in Iranian hands, and demobilized troops joined the ranks of the unemployed. Reconstruction projects remained on hold, and since July 1988 there had been at least 4 assassination attempts on Saddam's life, involving army officers, some of whom served in the Republican Guard, his elite bodyguards. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that Saddam desperately needed to secure his rule, and that Kuwait seemed the answer to his problem. He could pose as the liberator of a territory which many Iraqis regarded as rightfully theirs. Point 3. Economic factors. During the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam received loans of $40 billion from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Given Iraq's post-war shortage of money, he asked both countries to write off the loans on the grounds that he had halted the spread of the Islamic Revolution and thereby directly benefited both countries. But he also demanded new loans amounting to $30 billion. Both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait refused. Saddam was also annoyed that both countries had increased their oil revenues to the tune of $89 billion between 1981 and 1990, and he asked both to bring their oil production into line with the quotas fixed by OPEC. But yet again they refused. Saddam also claimed that Kuwait was illegally extracting Iraqi oil from the Rumaila oil field close to the Kuwait-Iraq border by engaging in what's known as slant drilling, and that the value of the oil stolen amounted to $2.4 billion. So, in explaining this point, you could argue that there were economic factors that explain the start of the First Gulf War, and that Saddam had accused both Gulf states of effectively waging an economic war against his country, and thus he threatened dire consequences if the matter could not be resolved. Point 4. Establishing regional leadership. Evidence to support this includes: the Iran-Iraq War had in part been an attempt by Iraq to establish regional dominance over the Gulf. Although Iran had been seriously weakened, the attempt had failed since Iraq secured no new territory or other advantages. And so the invasion of Kuwait was a renewed attempt to alter the power balance in the Gulf. If successful, Iraq would not only acquire massive new amounts of oil, but also 120 miles of Gulf coastline that included a large natural harbour. It would also place Iraq in an excellent position to dominate Saudi Arabia and achieve in a southerly and western direction what it had failed to achieve in an easterly direction against Iran. And so, in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that Saddam Hussein hoped to become the most powerful Arab leader in the Middle East, and that this was one reason for the start of the First Gulf War. Finally, point 5. The expected American reaction. Evidence to support this includes: if Saddam had known in advance that his invasion and occupation of Kuwait would create such a storm of both Arab and international protest, then he might have concentrated on diplomatic means to achieve his objectives. Prior to August 1990, Saddam's main concern had been to ensure that the US remained neutral in any move he made against Kuwait. Washington, though, had been sending conflicting signals as to its reaction to the nature of Saddam's regime, with Congress arguing for sanctions, but President Bush and his chief advisors stating that they were against such measures. In order to find out the likely attitude of the US administration to his intended invasion of Kuwait, Saddam summoned the US ambassador April Glaspie to Baghdad for a meeting on the 25th of July 1990. Glaspie apparently gave Saddam the clear impression that the matter was not one of key concern to the US. And so Saddam's very real threats were mistakenly interpreted as bluster and posturing, and were not met with firm responses. As a result, Saddam drew the conclusion that his adventure would be unopposed. And so, in linking this back to the question and explaining our point, you may wish to say that American ambivalence was one of the key factors in bringing about the First Gulf War. So, let's recap. Why did the First Gulf War take place? We have given a 5-point scope. Iraq had an historical claim. Saddam Hussein wanted to strengthen his domestic position. Economic factors. Regional leadership. And the expected American reaction. So now it's time for our clever conclusion. On the 2nd of August 1990, Saddam ordered the invasion of Kuwait, and within 24 hours, 100,000 Iraqi troops and 300 tanks had crushed the 16,000 strong Kuwaiti army and gained control of the principality. The ruler of Kuwait, Sheikh Jabbar al-Sabah, together with most of his family, escaped to Saudi Arabia, and Iraq was immediately condemned in the Arab League and at the UN. It is argued here, however, that a combination of economic and political factors worked together in bringing about the First Gulf War. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye!